At 12:14 a.m., a man living near Oak Road woke to the sound of a woman screaming. He checked his phone for the time. Then he went to the window and saw a man moving quickly back toward a car in the darkness. Minutes later, the headlights came on and the vehicle drove away. No one ever saw 21-year-old Libby Squire alive again. Her friends called her Libby. She was a philosophy student at the University of Hull, funny, bright, deeply loved, and by all accounts in a much better place than she had once been. But on the freezing night of January 31st, 2019, one ordinary student night out unraveled into one of the most haunting murder cases in modern Britain. A nightclub door, a taxi home, a short walk that should have lasted seconds. And then, somehow, she drifted into the path of a predator already prowling the streets looking for opportunity. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the ending. It is how small the window was. Libby arrived at the Welly Club around 11:20 p.m. She was refused entry for being too drunk, helped into a taxi by her friends, and sent back to Wellesley Avenue. She was close enough to safety that the rest of the night should have been uneventful. Instead, within less than an hour, prosecutors say she had been intercepted, taken to Oak Road playing fields, raped, murdered, and disposed of in the River Hull. And that is why this case lingers, because it was not a long disappearance into the unknown. It was not someone vanishing after days of silence. It was a collapse that happened almost in real time, inside one winter night, on streets covered by cameras, with strangers passing by and trying to help. The final stretch of Libby's life would later be reconstructed with terrifying precision. Not completely, because some details died with her killer's silence, but enough to show how quickly vulnerability can become fatal when the wrong person is already looking. Libby had grown up in the High Wycombe area of Buckinghamshire and was the eldest of 4 children. Her mother later said she had worked hard on her mental health and was in a good place by the time she went to university. She was close to her family, loved the social side of student life, and had begun to flourish at Hull. That matters because this case is often reduced to the final night. But for the people who knew her, Libby was not defined by how she died. She was someone trying to build a future. Studies, friendships, travel, all the ordinary next chapters that make a young life feel wide open. On the night she disappeared, Libby had been out drinking with friends before the group headed toward the Welly Club. CCTV showed her arriving there at 11:20 p.m., but she was visibly intoxicated and was refused entry. Her friends did what countless people do on student nights out. They put her into a taxi, paid the fare, and sent her home. At the time, it probably felt routine. Not ideal, but routine. Later, that decision would be picked apart with the cruelty of hindsight. But nothing about it would have seemed extraordinary in the moment. The taxi ride was short. Libby was dropped off near her house on Wellesley Avenue, but instead of making it safely inside and staying there, she turned away and started moving back along Beverly Road. CCTV later showed her weaving, falling, crying, and struggling in the snow and ice. Witnesses described her as drunk, upset, and difficult to understand. Some people stopped to help. She refused. At one point, she was seen lying in the snow. At another, sitting on a bench. The prosecutor later told the court that she was likely hypothermic, deeply distressed, and extremely vulnerable. This is one of the hardest parts of the story, because help was close. People did notice her. People did ask if she was okay, but vulnerability in public does not always look like danger in real time. Sometimes it looks like a drunk student insisting she is fine. Sometimes it looks like someone who does not want strangers near her. And in that gap, between visible distress and recognized danger, Libby kept moving alone through streets where another person was already circling. That person was Pawel Relowicz. By the time his name entered this case, he was 24 years old, a married father of 2, working as a butcher, and living close to the student area in Hull. To neighbors, and people who knew him casually, he did not look like the center of one of the country's most notorious crimes. But later court proceedings revealed something far darker. Long before Libby crossed his path, Relowicz had already been escalating through a pattern of sexually motivated behavior. Voyeurism, public indecency, stalking women at night, breaking into homes, stealing underwear and sex toys, and sometimes leaving used condoms behind like a signature. The sentencing judge described that earlier conduct as a perverted campaign of sexually deviant behavior. She said he had grown increasingly emboldened because he believed he would not be caught. In the months leading up to Libby's murder, his offenses had become more brazen. He watched women through their windows. He entered homes. He masturbated in public. He admitted during trial that he had a problem controlling his sexual urges, and that on the night Libby disappeared, he was out looking not just to expose himself or peep into bedrooms, but also for what he called an opportunity for easy sex. That language matters, because it reframes the case. This was not the story of a man who just happened to cross paths with a vulnerable woman and made one catastrophic decision. Prosecutors argued that he had been cruising the student area for hours, actively searching for opportunity. The CCTV did not show a random encounter followed by sudden panic. It showed movement, hesitation, positioning, and timing. In other words, it showed behavior that looked less like impulse and more like selection. Footage shown at trial captured Relowicz in his silver Vauxhall Astra, repeatedly moving through the neighborhood. Shortly before midnight, he parked near Haworth Street. Then he got out and began tracking Libby on foot. The prosecution said he crossed Beverly Road, then repositioned, apparently checking whether she was alone. At one point, he returned to his vehicle and sat there with the door open while another car passed through the street. Prosecutors suggested he was effectively waiting for the road to clear. Only after that did the final movement happen. Libby was seen going toward his car. By 12:08 a.m., she was inside it. A gold digital watch later found near the spot where she entered the vehicle became another quietly devastating detail. It had a damaged clasp, and DNA confirmed it belonged to Libby. Investigators believed something had happened at that moment. Some force, struggle, or abrupt movement that caused the watch to come off. The prosecution did not need to prove whether she was physically forced into the car or manipulated into accepting help. In her condition, either possibility was enough to show how exposed she was. She was cold, disoriented, intoxicated, and crying for her mother. From that moment on, as the judge later put it, she did not stand a chance. The drive from Haworth Street to Oak Road playing fields took only about 3 minutes. CCTV showed the Astra leaving with Libby at 12:08 a.m. and arriving at the playing fields around 12:11 a.m. Then in that darkness, the timeline narrows to something almost unbearable. A nearby witness later described hearing deep, loud, frantic screaming. ITV's reconstruction placed the car leaving the area at 12:19 a.m. The defense would later lean heavily on that compressed window, arguing it was too short for the prosecution's account. But the prosecution's answer was blunt. Libby was already extremely vulnerable, and Relowicz was physically capable, focused, and determined. The truth is that some parts of those final minutes remain uncertain even now. Pathologists could not determine Libby's exact cause of death because her body had been in the water for so long. They could not say with certainty whether she was dead before she entered the river or dying when she was put there. The prosecution's case was that Relowicz raped her, murdered her, and then disposed of her body in the river hull. The judge said that whether she was dead or only dying, he put her in the river to prevent her from being found. That uncertainty, that terrible final gap, is one reason the case remains so agonizing for her family. What happened next only deepened the horror. Nearly 2 hours later, around 2:25 a.m., CCTV showed Relowicz returning to Oak Road for just over 4 minutes before driving away again. The exact reason for that return has never been fully established, but investigators treated it as deeply suspicious. Whether he came back to check the scene, move something, or reassure himself that nothing had been left behind, it suggested unfinished business. And the night still was not over. The prosecution also presented evidence that after Libby disappeared, he was later captured on CCTV, committing another sexual act in public. By the next day, Libby was missing, and the case exploded into public view. What began as a missing person inquiry quickly became the largest missing person investigation in Humberside police history. Officers searched waterways, drains, streets, bins, gardens, outbuildings, anywhere she might have gone in the cold. Students and volunteers joined the effort. Her parents went public, pleading for information. Police reviewed CCTV from across the area because Libby had left no messages suggesting she planned to meet anyone. There was no secret arrangement on her phone pointing to another destination. If investigators were going to solve this, the cameras were going to have to do most of the talking. Then the surveillance gave them their break. Once detectives narrowed the time window using witness accounts and CCTV, the Astra kept appearing. The same silver car had been cruising the student area for hours. It had been in the right streets, at the right time, near the exact place where Libby entered a vehicle and vanished. On February 6th, less than a week after she disappeared, police arrested Relowicz on suspicion of abducting her. That arrest opened a door into a much wider pattern. His fingerprints and DNA began matching earlier unsolved sexual offenses in Hull. Suddenly, the man under suspicion in Libby's disappearance was no longer just a possible abductor. He was linked to a disturbing history of predatory behavior that had been escalating for years. Inside his car, detectives found a pink holdall containing stolen items, including women's underwear, sex toys, and photographs of women apparently taken without their knowledge. Some items were stained with his semen and saliva. He initially denied ever seeing Libby. Then, once confronted with the CCTV, his story changed. Now he said he had only been trying to help her. A good Samaritan giving a drunk student a ride home. Later he changed it again, claiming they had consensual sex at Oak Road before he left her there alive. Prosecutors said each new version merely shifted to accommodate whatever evidence had already surfaced. For weeks, though, one unbearable question remained unanswered. Where was Libby? On March 20th, 2019, nearly 7 weeks after she disappeared, a body was discovered in the Humber estuary. It was later identified as Libby. The length of time in the water had destroyed crucial forensic clarity. Her body was so decomposed that the pathologist could not determine the precise cause of death. But forensic examination did establish that she had been raped. And eventually, further testing found Relowicz's DNA on and inside her body. That evidence shattered his Good Samaritan story and undercut the later claim that the encounter had been consensual. Even before the murder trial began, Relowicz had already admitted guilt to 9 separate sexual offenses from 2017 to early 2019. Those included voyeurism, burglary, and outraging public decency. Later reporting and the sentencing remarks make clear that this prior offending was not treated as background noise. It was part of the logic of the case. Prosecutors argued that Libby's murder was not an isolated eruption, but the endpoint of escalation. A man who had spent months getting bolder, crossing lines, and discovering that he could continue without immediate consequence. The murder and rape trial finally began in January 2021 after pandemic delays. The prosecution described Relowicz as a predator who had gone out that night looking for a vulnerable woman. They said Libby was drunk, likely hypothermic, and in deep distress when he found her. The defense focused on the short time window and argued the prosecution had not proved murder. They accepted that he had taken advantage of Libby and bore strong moral responsibility for what happened, but denied that the evidence conclusively showed he had killed her. Relowicz himself continued to insist the sex was consensual and that he left her alive. The jury rejected that. In February 2021, Relowicz was found guilty of raping and murdering Libby Squire. He was convicted of rape unanimously and of murder by a majority verdict. The next day, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. The judge said his earlier crimes showed an escalating pattern, that he had prowled Hull looking for women, and that Libby had been so vulnerable that from the moment he intercepted her, she had no real chance of protecting herself physically or mentally. Even after the minimum term, she said, he may never be released. And still, conviction did not bring clarity to everything. Libby's family have said there is no closure because the one person who truly knows what happened in those final moments has never fully explained it. They do not know exactly how she died. They do not know whether she was alive when she entered the river. They do not know what she understood in those last minutes, whether she realized where she was, whether she could fight, whether she knew she was in mortal danger. Those are the kinds of questions that verdicts cannot answer, and for families, those questions often become their life sentence. That is also why Libby's story did not end in court. In the years since the trial, her mother, Libby Squire, has become one of the most visible advocates in Britain for taking so-called lower-level or non-contact sexual offenses seriously. She has argued that indecent exposure, voyeurism, and similar crimes are not minor. They are red flags. In 2023, she said she believed the man who later murdered Libby had exposed himself to her weeks before the killing. In 2024, she gave evidence to MPS and continued pressing the case that earlier intervention matters because patterns like Relowicz's do not usually begin with murder. They begin smaller and then they grow. And maybe that is the most haunting lesson in this entire case. Not just that a young woman disappeared after a night out. Not just that CCTV caught almost every step of the trap closing around her, but that the man who killed her had been showing the world, again and again, exactly what he was becoming. Voyeurism, stalking, burglary with sexual motives, public indecency, escalation. And still, by the time Libby crossed his path, he was out there in a car, free to keep circling. So remember Libby for more than the footage. Remember the student who was building a future. The daughter her family still speaks about with extraordinary love. The young woman who had worked hard to get herself into a better place and believed she was at the start of something new. Because this case is horrifying for the way it happened, but it is devastating for what it took. And if there is one truth that stays behind after everything else, it is this. Libby was only minutes from home, and that was still not enough. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. We truly hope this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue creating content, please like the video, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support really makes a difference, and we genuinely appreciate every person who helps keep these stories from being forgotten.